because I'm profoundly deaf these days, just advanced old age coming on prematurely. I'd love to say it was because of a misspent youth. No such excuse. It's just a genetic thing in the family. And so I control my hearing aids with the help of my phone. I've got a microphone on Todd, and with my other one. Yeah. When we come to Mrs. Points you'd like to make, I'll pass this to you. And if you just hold it naturally like that, I'll alter the volume on the app here and hopefully be able to pick up your accents, so a bit different from our part of the world. So forgive me if I don't pick you up quite right. I'm giving 2 talks today. Todd has asked me to speak to you about water in the context of where I come from. And after that, I'll be giving a public lecture nearby on intergenerational trauma, on things that have happened to us, not just in our families, but in our cultures, that have knocked down through the generations. And the island where I grew up, the Isle of Lewis, in the Outer Hebrides of Scotland here, these islands that you see off here, the Isle of Lewis, my village is 8 miles from where the village that Donald Trump's mother came from. She was born in 1912. She emigrated to New York in 1930, when she was just turning 18. And this afternoon I'll be looking at the tragic background which led so many Scottish people to come to the New World, either because they were forced by being evicted from their lands, and I'll be talking about how Trump's maternal ancestors were actually evicted by rapacious property developers. I'll be showing you slides of that if you have time to come. I realise it's end of term and you'll have a lot on your mind. So I'll be talking about that, and then speculating on what happens when a person or when a family is broken away from being held in the basket of their own communities. And we were just overseeing Addy's woke exhibition, and the irony that the people forced off their land in Scotland, many of them landed here, and so did the slaves land here. And the difference was skin colour. We were all indigenous people. We were all ripped from our homes. Black folks, as I use the term black in the sense we use it in a British context, where black people strongly own the identity of being black. And I think you've already pointed out to me, Todd, that here I should be speaking of African Americans, but forgive me if I slip from time to time into the way of speaking of what is that respectful way of speaking of where I'm coming from in Scotland. So African Americans obviously ripped from their communities very much more brutally than happened with most white folks. And then what's the difference? We were both indigenous peoples, but white folks had white skins, and so it was more easy for white folks to become oppressors. You can't beat them, so you join them kind of dynamic. So that's what I'm going to be unpacking later on. But this class is about water, and I'm going to talk about water in the context of Scotland. And I'm going to speak for maybe about half an hour or thereabouts, and then open it up to discuss these themes with you. The Carolinas, North and South, they have an important part in the heart of Scotland because so many Scottish people came here. And it's only been fairly recently that we've been unpacking our own history, and there's been a whole plethora of books published recently unpacking the fact that when they did come here, many of them became managers of slave plantations. And I think you're going to take me to, is it MacLeod Plantation? The MacLeod is the most common name on our island. And so this is, what this is partly about, is facing up to both what those of us who are white folks from that kind of background, like I am, like many of you here perhaps, what our people have done to others in what was the British Empire, but also to understand what happened to us so we can awake, or as you're saying over here, become woke. I've only just learned that word today. It was fantastic. We're just awakening to that. And because we realize we need to understand ourselves, we need to understand the roots of our poverty and in our cities and so on. And that's kind of what I want to start off talking to you about. Because here's my house in Glasgow. I don't know if we didn't have the solar panels when you were here, Todd, did you? You know, our energy bills are $130 a year. Before that, they were about $2,000 a year. And it's not just the solar panels, which in Scotland, where it rains a lot, are relatively poorly productive. They produce about 3,000 units just over a year. What I've done is I pumped that through a heat pump, an air source heat pump. And so we make really good use of our energy. And that way, you're somebody like me, who, because a lot of my work, as you will hear in the next lecture especially, is quite radical work. It's been difficult to work in the mainstream institutions, but I'm able to live on a relatively low amount of money because we use green technology intelligently like that. Now go around the corner from our house, and that is the next street where we live. My wife and I have chosen to live in what I would call a hard-pressed area, an area with a lot of poverty, an area where the people are people who originally came to Scotland from Ireland at the time of the famine, which you might have heard of in the 1840s, when basically the British state was sucking food out of Ireland, but the Irish were starving because the potato crop failed. And the population of Ireland declined by 1/3 in that time through outright death from famine and through emigration that took place at the time. But there are also people coming from the Scottish Highlands primarily, who had moved down at the time when people were being evicted from the land by the kind of people who evicted the maternal ancestors of Donald Trump. And so basically we live in a nice house, as you can see, but as sometimes the case in poor areas, you get a nice street in amongst pockets of poverty. That's our news agent where we go to buy our bread and newspapers and so on. And round the next corner, you know, this is what the local kids did when they were bored one night because there was nothing for them. And we live there because I'm one of the founders of a project called the Gal Gael Trust. Now, Gal means a stranger in Gaelic, and Gael means the heartland people. So this is about saying we must all become indigenous to where we live. But there's something of the stranger and something of the indigenous in all of us. And so we're embracing both of those in that understanding. And there you see our people, and if you just look at those faces, you know, you'll see poverty written in a lot of those faces. And it's often intergenerational poverty that knocks on from family to family. I mean, in American terminology, our people are what would be called white trash. And these are my friends and neighbors, these are people of deep heart. So what do? We build boats in our workshop. Our question is how to help people reconnect, because poverty disconnects, or it can disconnect. If you've got a strong community with poverty, you can stay connected. But when your community is broken up because you've been pushed off the land and pushed around, it disconnects. and that uproots the soul. So our work is about trying to reconnect people whose brokenness you can see written in their faces. And we do that by connecting young people with old people. There are a lot of young folk in this kind of social context. Many of them have not grown up, maybe not knowing who their father was, or very broken families. Because the psychology of these things, you know, when your psychology has been screwed up, your whole life screws up. So we reconnect. Fred O'Hara here spent 14 years in jail for gangsterism. So when he talks to the young guys and says, you know, don't go down the way I went, it speaks loud. That's inside our workshop, where people are learning to make things of beauty out of natural materials, mainly wood, but also basket work, stone, fabrics, metal too. And some of our folk, like Ronnie here, recovering, quite a lot of our folk, trying to recover from heroin addiction, alcohol addiction, etc. And this is what I mean by building things of beauty in the workshop. And then going out onto the water. The River Clyde flows through Glasgow. So we get out onto the water in boats we've built ourselves. And this connects people not only back to the river, as some people say, Gal Gale gave us back our river. Because generally going out in the water is something that those of us from middle class backgrounds, like me with a father who's a doctor, we take it for granted, but for folk like this who've never had a chance to get out on the river. And we maybe raise the sail and give people the experience of community with nature. And that community of nature starts to build community with each other. And so you start to get reconnection of people and place. Now, that's one aspect of what I want to share with you. And the other aspect, and I want to go more deeply into what water is about. I'm not going to be talking about the theories that some people have about water carrying imprints and homeopathic theories of water and so on. That's not my area. But I'd like to share with you now, in our Scots-Irish tradition, you might say our Celtic traditions, in those traditions which we share with many other European people, and that I discovered when I lived for 4 years in Papua New Guinea, indigenous peoples across the world share these things. These are markers of indigeneity. Water is often understood as being a profound gift of life, which has sacred associations, sacramental associations. And I'd like to share with you from my book Poacher's Pilgrimage, where I've walked through our own island. Brought some of my books here. I'm at the end of my journey, so that I think I'll go for $10, pretty much cost price. That's what I've got left. Today's afternoon talk, or today, if any of you are wanting any. I'm talking about a walk that I made through the Isle of Lewis, and the southern part is called the Isle of Harris. It's one island joined by mountains, or separated by mountains, I suppose. And I spent 12 days walking right across the wild lands and then up into the villages of the northeast. And I had 3 focuses of doing that. I was basically exploring what I've come to call an ecology of the imagination. The question, do we simply have imagination? Or do we also move in a greater cosmic imagination? It's a question of consciousness. Is consciousness generated by molecules in our brain? Or perhaps given some of the evidence, like when people have near-death experiences and technically they are brain dead before being resuscitated, and they come back with very detailed, structured experiences that they might have had, that suggests that there might be more to death than just dying. There might be a deeper level of life. Might it be the case that instead the brain acts like a radio receiver that picks up our little share of the signal of consciousness? You see? And that the process of spiritual development, if you believe in spiritual reality, or at least if you're prepared to treat spiritual reality as a hypothesis, but I think it's important to be scientific about these things, to be empirical. The process of spiritual development is about widening the aperture of that little bit of consciousness that's mine, starting to see that we are profoundly interconnected. That's a kind of question. With our imagination, are we just walking through a landscape, an environment, or are we also walking in something where, as a friend of mine, Nora Bateson, the daughter of the great philosopher Gregory Bateson, who wrote Steps to an Ecology of Mind, put it to me, she said, perhaps we don't know what it is that we are inside of. Is that what it's about? And in religious traditions, you know, the Hindu tradition says Atman is Brahman, the Buddhists say we are all Buddha nature. Christ says we're all branches in the vine of life. Paul says we're members one of another. In Islam, the Prophet, peace be upon him, says that all Muslims are as one body. It's similar understanding that is the spiritual understanding. So that's the kind of question I'm exploring. But my focus, my threefold focus, was the ancient healing sites, the ancient dwellings out in the moors, where people would go for two main purposes. One would be to look after the girls of, typically girls of your age, girls just before the age of getting married, would go and they would take the cattle out. And they would spend 3 months of the summer out in the remote moors, maybe 2 or 3 girls in one of the shearings. Sometimes young men coming back from the fishing would visit, and sometimes marriages would follow on from that, the way that happens in rural communities. That was one use. And the other use, which we can tell this both from the oral history and from the place names, is you get place names like Ari and Taggart. The Ari, the shieling, the hut of the Taggart, the priest's hut. Places that would have been used for spiritual contemplation. Okay? So we just had lunch with Ade, and he was saying how his girlfriend was wrongly imprisoned for 24 years for an alleged murder that she hadn't committed, and for 18 years of that she was in solitary confinement. And I said, what happened during that? And he said, her consciousness opened to God. She came out not hating, but forgiving, because she filled with love. Now this is what can happen when you go out into nature for a prolonged period. Your consciousness can start to open. So this is why, for me, these shearings were important. Also the ancient sacred sites, what they call in Gaelic the chapel, meaning in English temples, the old temples, which were the pre-Reformation, the old Catholic, Celtic church buildings, now in ruins. And thirdly, the ancient wells. And the wells were often associated with the temples. The temple would be built near a well. So I'm just going to show you on this walk that I made. I call it a poacher's pilgrimage, but I took a fishing rod so I could poach the lochs and try and feed myself partly on the way. but a few jokes around that. And I walked through the length of the island, way back in 2009, but it took me 7 years to write about it. So here are my guidebooks, the chapels, or the temples, and the healing wells. And the author of these books is my good friend, the Gaelic tradition bearer, Dr. Finlay MacLeod. Now those of you who know the Christian symbol of the fish, which is sometimes on bumper stickers, will see that Finlay, the Darwinian atheist, his fishes grow nice. He's the island's most famous atheist. And he writes these kind of books. And I put it to you that Finlay is somebody who has seen religion go very wrong. I'll be talking about in my next lecture. Seen religion go very wrong, become conceited, judgmental. A world view that we are the elect, actually smaller than that, excuse us. We are the elect, the rest of you are the damned. As Patti Smith put it, Jesus died for someone's sins, but not mine. You see, that can go very wrong, and so Donald Trump, whose mother was of that tradition, I asked to what extent is the war with Mexico a wall that runs through his mind, through Donald Trump's mind. This binary division of reality. You're either one of us or you're not. You're on the axis. Which side of the axis of evil do you fall on? You see how the theological mindset can play out in the judgmental way. Same happens in Islam with Wahhabist Islam. You know, it's a kind of the way that the psychology of the human mind can hijack religion in these ways. So there's my friend Finlay and his books. And I had other informants. That's my wife, Ren, on the left, who's taken about 10 years ago, that picture. But, you know, other informants were the Campbell sisters, Katrina and Nan here. Out here, this is their family shearing. Away we are, 4 hours walking out into distant woods to get there. These are the kind of people. And many of these remote places are associated. When you look at the old maps, you'll find that they are associated with the names of saints, especially St. Michael and St. Patrick and St. Bridget, or Bridget in Gaelic, or St. Bride, as she's known, different names for the same woman. So here we've got St. Bride, who, in the tradition, and this is a famous painting in the National Gallery of Scotland by John Duncan. Notice the Celtic knotwork in the angel's robes. We have the tradition that Bridget was carried across the waves from Iona. So she's basically the same as Bridget of Kildare in Ireland. But what you find with many of these saints in ancient parts of Europe is that the saint gets localized in different places. The different places will claim them for her. So in Scotland we claim Bridget for Iona, in Ireland they claim her for Kildare, but it's basically the same archetypal principle. And in the Scottish tradition, on the eve of the night on which Jesus was born, Bridget was taken from Iona in her sleep by angels and carried to Bethlehem, where she became the foster mother of Christ. And what that does is it means that Bridget gets named the Mary of the Isles, because in our Celtic tradition, fostership, adoption counts for more than blood lineage. In that way it helps, traditionally it helps our people to feel connected with that story happening in the Middle East. What you have to be careful of is you don't then appropriate it, because what white supremacy has done is it has appropriated, it has stolen the story. And, you know, Jesus said instead of being a person of colour becomes a white man and all the rest of it, and is used to oppress people of colour. This is why the human mind is always subject to what some theologians call the fall. So that's the importance of Bridget, and here's a loch just near the house I grew up in was just over that hill. That's Loch Torted region, which I've caught many, many fish out of that loch when I was a boy. A loch is a Scottish word for lake. And that Loch Torted region, the loch of Bridget's ruin. And you look a bit more carefully, and that's one of my school friends, Rusty. And there we are, sitting in the foundations of the ruin. It's now all, it's all overgrown, but you've basically got big stone foundations in there. There's been some kind of a hut, perhaps used for spiritual contemplation, associated with Bridget in the past, and that giving her name, the saint's name, to the place name. The Welsh poet R.S. Thomas has a line that says, basically, for all the historical changes, the parish has a saint's name that time cannot unfrock. The parish has a saint's name that time cannot unfrock. So we've had the religious reformation, the change from Catholicism to Protestantism. Bridget is no longer a name used of Ireland girls because it's not seen as being a Protestant name, and yet it's embodied in our places, Loch Torted region. And there you see her, the shepherdess, in this nativity scene in a stained glass window here in one of the island churches. So onto the walking. I started at the foot of this mountain here. Any of you know my book, Soil and Soul, it tells of the battle we had with corporate power to stop this mountain being subjected to the equivalent of your mountaintop removal. Not quite the same, but very similar, but for roadstone. And we've got a medieval church at the foot of it, right in the south of Harris here. And I started walking along the bays area of Harris. That's looking over, that's the Isle Sky that you can see over there. I'm walking and walking for 12 days, immersed in land and water, space, through the villages. One of my first stopping points using Dr. Finley's little book was to search for the well of the blacksmiths. Now the blacksmiths were the famous Protestant evangelists who used this water for its supposed healing properties, especially for dealing with stomachache. And very probably before that it would have had a different name, probably a saint's name. But the blacksmith in question, who lived in the mid-19th century, was in Protestant terms seen as being a kind of saint. So this is Toba Angora, the well of the blacksmiths, except it had been lost. The old women of the village told me that nobody had seen that well for 30 years. And they said, but you go and look for it. They gave me a spade. And I went scouting around in the field where it supposedly was, and I saw a big ball of sphagnum moss, and I started digging under the stone, and I hit on a bottle. Aha, why would a bottle be there? Well, here we are, I mixed my slides up. I should have shown you this one first. There's a ball of sphagnum moss. And there is a well recovered. And the old women were so thrilled. A friend of mine went back and spoke to them. He could hardly believe the story. And he met up with, oh, have I taken it out? I've not got a slide. Sorry, I thought I had the slide in there. My friend was one of these old women in the village. And they were so thrilled that the well had been recovered. It still mattered to them. And these are people who are conservative, evangelical Protestants. And yet, something of that spirit still running in them. That water is about 18 inches deep, a stone surrounded it. It's not, it's exactly as the women described to me. They said it's about 18 inches square and 18 inches deep. And very cold water because it's rising water. It's water that's coming up from deep underneath. So that was my first experience. And then we're talking about the sea. What's going on here? When I was a boy, the fishing in our area, not the sea fishing, had not yet been destroyed by overfishing. That subsequently happened when I was a boy. And the old men would take us out in the boats and teach us how to catch fish. And I would catch a bucket full of haddock and whiting, flounders and so on. And I would come back, and most people didn't have fridges or freezers, so we would share out stuff. And maybe they'd killed a sheep and they'd give me some lamb or some eggs or something like that. We had an exchange economy as well as cash economy coming in. And here's a kind of reminder of that, because when I was a boy, so I'm 62 now, I'm talking about when I was about 12, well, up until the age of about 20, which would be when I last saw this intact. There was a boat. That's the roof of this shed, an upturned boat. And I was thrilled, and I was walking along and I came here, and there is the remains of the boat, still there. With copper nails in the wood, and so on. And you know, that kind of thing, it connects you back to your childhood, it connects you to place and to these stories. And then I'm walking on, I'm going to go up into this mountain pass, and I'm going to be 4 days up here, walking without meeting a single human being. And what's this? Fairyland. This is one of the shearing sites, a beehive shearing. Kind of places that the girls would come and look after the cows in. Notice its location. You only ever build something where you've got water. In the I Ching, or I Ching, or however you pronounce it, or I Ching, the Chinese oracle, one of the oracles is for the well. And the oracle says, the city may, or people may move, but the well does not move. Therefore, the city must be where the well is located. Water constellates human community. And then walking through these areas, now this is what I'm going to be, this is the kind of area where Trump's ancestors would force off the land. In these places you can still see the marks of the landscapes, the lines of the raised bed agriculture. There's ruins in amongst here, but the only one still standing is a gamekeeper's cottage, because these rivers were full of salmon. So like with Native American peoples, how people relied on the salmon run for feeding themselves, especially in winter when the salmon would be up spawning. As I walked, I fed myself on shellfish that I gathered from the shore, and sorrel that I also found growing at the shore. That was part of my food supply. I didn't catch any fish worth talking about, although I tried. The mists came down, the storm came in. I was navigating by map and compass through deep morasses of bogs like you see here. I could have written a coffee table book called Bogs That I Have Known and Loved. And some of them, by the way, that's not pollution. What looks like oil is actually a very thin, molecule-thick layer of iron minerals that refracts the light and looks like oil, but it's actually iron coming from the spring. Look how deep some of them are. Imagine with that iced over in winter and you don't see it when you put your fruit. Go down a long way. This is the island's most famous salmon river, which I crossed. It was in flood. That was quite an adventure. And then I came to Bridges Shearing in Gary Breager, the garden or the enclosure of St. Bridget. Way out where nobody ever goes. There it is. Small one and the bigger one. And then I moved back to where people live amongst the menhirs, the Calanish standing stones. These ancient sacred sites. There's my fishing rod. which is Mill Village. And I connected up again with Dr. Finlay, who took me to Bridget's Well, Toba region. So you've got the island's most notorious atheist. And he's just so deeply moved, he's almost in tears as he offers me a drink from the well. Because this speaks to him. It is. He said to me as I put the cup in, he said, "Be careful of the spider's web." And you also see a white slug that's taken that breath that's there. And here's another one, Toba Vora. Vora in Gaelic is, from which we get the name Moira, is a special term for the Blessed Virgin Mary. So, you know, our kind of Calvinistic Protestants, they don't do the Blessed Virgin Mary. That's a Catholic thing. And yet, the parish bears a saint's name that time cannot confirm. And the local historical society has made this little stone tablet to mark it. St. Mary's Well. And so I ended up in the north of the island, another case of one of the ancient temples, Chapel Peda here, St. Peter's Temple, again beside a river with a supply of water. And it had been raining intensely, the snails had come down. Love was happening in the cemetery. In the midst of death in the cemetery, love was happening. Fecundated by water. And so, St. Ronan's Temple, Champel Ronan, the saint that supposedly brought Christianity to us in the 6th century. And of Ronan, it said that he got fed up living here in the village because the men were always arguing about everything, and the women were always gossiping about nothing, is how he put it in the tradition. And so it was that a great whale with eyes that gleamed like the stars at night sailed in, and Ronan jumped onto the whale's back and was taken 40 miles further north to the remote island now named after him of North Rona, where he built a temple well away from the pursuits of humankind, so that in solitude with nature he might more deeply find God. So at a deep level, and anchoring back in with Galgale, this is how we reclaim our heritage. This is how we reconnect our coastal communities. And I've come over here to talk about these things with my former student, Todd, and we had a wonderful time. I met Todd, first of all, at the Schumacher College in England, and then he came to be a student in human ecology, the relationship between people and nature. And I'm just so happy to see him here with his family and teaching you folks, and appreciative to be sharing with your class. What I'd like to suggest before we just go open to questions is if you'd like to turn to one of your neighbours, preferably 2s, maximum 3s, and just I'll give you 2 or 3 minutes, just discuss what most struck you. It doesn't have to be positive. I'm going to say what spoke to you most powerfully.